From 2010 through 2015, I was living out of a van. I would travel all over the country, staying in Walmart parking lots, friends' driveways, campsites, oftentimes just down some path in the woods that was wide enough to fit my vehicle. I have countless wild adventure stories from that 5-year period, but I'll share with you one that really left a mark, both physically and mentally. For the last 2 years of my homeless stint, I had stuck to the east coast of the United States, slowly making my way north to New Hampshire and Maine in the warmer months, then heading slowly south as winter approached to avoid the blistering cold of the northern states in the eastern U.S. I had made friends and contacts from Florida to Maine and would stop for a week or two at certain locations to work, make some travel money, visit with people I knew along the way. One of the ways I would make money was with buying and selling antique guns. So, I would do my best to avoid certain states that were not gun-friendly, like Massachusetts, Maryland, and New Jersey, as I would usually have a gun or two with me and would always have a threat of being harassed by the local and state police due to my lifestyle. The previous years while heading north, I had decided to save time by breaking my travel rule by passing through New Jersey. I had made friends while camping in the backwoods of New Jersey, people known as Pineys. They call themselves that because they live in a little-known but fairly vast forest in the southern half of the state, known as the Pine Barrens. These good folks took an instant liking to me and spent almost a week living at my campsite with me. They worked as roofers during the day and drank booze and raised hell at night. They were super friendly, fiercely loyal, and hardworking. In 2015, as I was heading south for Central Florida, I made sure to swing by New Jersey again to hang with the Pineys, make a little cash roofing with them. So, I spent 6 12-hour days roofing with my friends, stayed in my van, parked at my friend's, and the small farm in the Pine Barrens. On my 7th day, I decided that after hearing endless tales about the wonders of the Pine Barrens from my piney friends all week, that I needed to go and explore the woods of southern New Jersey for a bit before heading south for the winter. I went online, found a campsite that allowed for vehicle camping, and was perfectly situated on the Mullica River. It even had miles and miles of hiking trails. I kept a rather expensive folding mountain bike in my van. Was always looking for a chance to take it out and explore. Due to the very flat land, the Pine Barrens was the perfect place for that. I set up camp and was thrilled on the first night to be able to have a fire and enjoy the cool night air while losing myself in the dance of the flickering flames. I spent the next few days biking around the wilderness, fishing the river, and howling back and forth with the local coyotes at night. On the 4th night, things began getting weird. The coyotes that had kept me company each prior night were nowhere to be found, and I kept hearing a loud whistling every so often in the woods, just around my campsite. Just like a human whistle, except louder. Around midnight, I could hear somebody slowly circling me as I sat at my fire. It sounded just like a human, on 2 feet, trying to be quiet, as they moved through the dead and dry leaves, just out of sight. I began to feel uneasy. Even though it was not allowed in New Jersey, I grabbed my snub-nosed .357 Magnum out of the van and kept it in my jacket pocket. When most people think of New Jersey, they think of a densely populated city or Jersey Shore beaches. But make no mistake, southern New Jersey can be as backwoods and deliverance feeling as parts of western Virginia. Although it was a little risky, I decided that it would be best to keep my .357 on me for the rest of my time there, just to be safe. The next day, I spent the area exploring on foot. I hiked for miles and came across what looked like a primitive campsite. It had two small shelters made from branches, twisted saplings all weaved together. Inside one of the shelters was a few items of old, torn clothing, an old functioning boombox, and a few chrome pieces of car. The shelters were in no way weatherproof, as there was no way to keep the rain out of them. So, I was very confused as to why somebody would go to such elaborate lengths to build them. On the edge of the campsite clearing were multiple trees that had fallen over away from the campsite. 4 medium-sized pine trees, fallen in opposite directions from each other, roots sticking out of the sandy soil. That afternoon, after a long day of exploration, I made my way back to my van, had a big meal, and went to sit on a bed of perfect moss along the edge of the Mullica River. I sat there, watched the sunset. The sun was about to dip down behind the trees, and I was sitting there with my headphones on, listening and relaxing to music, waiting for the evening to slowly creep in. I was feeling so alive. Just then, a barnyard-type smell filled the air around me, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. A chill ran down my spine. I began to pivot to my right, look behind me, and the last thing I remember was something smashing into the whole right side of my head and face. Tremendous pain. Then a loud ringing. I was awakened by the stinging of a sharp tree branch scratching across the left side of my face. As I opened my eyes, I saw the ground beneath me moving, and my chin was bouncing off a solid hide with coarse hair as the earth moved below me. The pain in my head was almost unbearable. I fought to stay awake. These few seconds were very confusing. I opened my eyes again, started to look around, and saw 2 huge hairy legs below me, moving in stride. Then, I felt another almost unbearable pain as my ankles were compressed together, grinded against each other, while whatever was carrying me adjusted its grip around them, crushing them together. I realized all of a sudden that somebody was carrying me over their shoulder and moving quickly through the woods. I was in a state of shock. I was also in pain from my head to my feet, but a huge surge of adrenaline hit me, all at once, and now I was wide awake. I was too afraid to start kicking and screaming and draw any attention to myself, so I went into a mental panic as I searched for an option in my head. Then it hit me. I remembered that I had my .357. It was in the small of my back in a leather holster with a snap button closure. My right arm was blocked by the creature head, so I reached behind myself with my left hand, quickly unsnapped the holster strap, struggled to free my gun as it was set up to be drawn by my right hand. Nevertheless, I managed to get it free, brought it in front of myself, thumb-cocked the hammer, put the barrel right onto the hairy back, directly below me, and squeezed the trigger. The gun went off, sending a 158-grain lead-nosed bullet into the right side of my attacker's back at point-blank range. The creature let out a bellowing scream, dropped me right on top of my head. I rolled onto my right side, and finally got a good look at what had been carrying me. It was no doubt a Bigfoot. There was no doubt at what I was looking at. I knew what it was the second I saw it, and have never been so terrified in my life. It was facing my direction while reaching its right hand behind itself and clawing at the hole I had put in its back, all while staring at me in disbelief. I still had the gun in my left hand, so I took aim at this monster again. When I pointed the gun, its expression changed from pure pain and disbelief to fear. I shot at it again, somewhere center mass as it was turning to run. It yelped, much like a dog does when it gets hurt, tore off into the brush at an incredible speed. I could hear it crashing through the brush and trees, like a freight train, as it ran off in the distance. I stayed there on my side for a few seconds, with my left hand still pointing the gun and shaking wildly. I then thought to myself, what if it comes back? Instantly, I was overwhelmed with fear. I jumped to my feet, sprinted as fast as I could in the opposite direction that this thing had gone. I ran for only a few hundred yards before I knew where I was. It would seem that the Bigfoot had only gone a short distance before I had woken up. I ran to my campsite, started frantically throwing everything haphazardly into my van. I was sure that this thing was going to come back for revenge at any moment. I checked the cylinder of my 5-shot revolver, quickly replaced the 2 spent shells with fresh rounds, then stomped on the gas and ripped out of there. After a few minutes of driving on the dirt roads, I finally came out to the pavement, and my fear began to subside. But at the same time, the pain in my head and face spiked to terrible levels, so I headed for the nearest hospital. When I got to the ER, I did not even consider what I was going to tell them happened to me. I looked like I was hit by a Mack truck. Felt like it too. I decided to tell them that I was attacked by somebody in the woods. This was a bad idea. They had a police officer there within a few minutes to take a report. He could tell I was not telling the truth, and kept pressing me to say what really happened. I stuck to my story, and he eventually left. Turns out I had suffered a bad concussion, as well as a torn eardrum in my right ear. The next day, my face swelled up so badly that my right eye was swollen shut, and my jaw hurt so badly that I couldn't even chew solid food for almost a week. I think that Bigfoot had smacked me hard with his open hand upside my head, but I can't be sure. Needless to say, I never went camping in the Pine Barrens after that. I called my friends from that area, told them what had happened to me, and they confirmed that every so often, someone will encounter a Bigfoot creature like that in the woods, here, around where they live. Never again for me. Okay, so I would like to keep this somewhat discreet, because my family still to this day use what I told them as a joke against me. I don't need everybody in my town talking about me, because this just sounds ridiculous. This happened near Toms River, New Jersey. Me and my buddy were on our way to a job in Browns Mills, and were traveling down Route 70, which is known as the Pine Barrens. It was somewhere between 6 and 7 in the morning. About 7 deer came shooting out from the right side, going left across Route 70. I did not slam on brakes, because it was like 50 feet in front of us, but I stopped pretty fast, and I kid you not, there was a big hairy gray and brown thing that came running right up to about 3 feet from the pavement. It stopped and turned around and ran the other way back into the woods. Since I seen this, I began watching that Finding Bigfoot show, but their videos and pictures are always something black. This thing was light gray and brown, and it was huge. I mean huge, like 8 foot tall. Big, like fat big. It could not be a guy because it had hair all over its face. Like, I didn't even see its eyes or lips or nose. It was like hair for a face. We seen this thing at about 25-35 feet. I know it was real, because my man was totally in sync with describing it to each other. It was all we talked about for the rest of the way to the job. It was like what I was thinking he was saying, and vice versa. This was just 2 months ago, and that was it. Hope this helps. I was a Boy Scout in the early 1970s on a camping trip. On a summer night, a friend and myself were out walking on a lone gravel road. Tall pine trees on both sides. It was the Bass River State Forest. The moon was full, and we were getting ready to crest a hill when we smelled something really foul. I thought something was dead and nearby. I didn't really think too much of it. We crested the gravel hill when we heard gravel being kicked. Mind you, the only light we had was the moonlight. When we heard this, we stopped, and I was a little scared because I thought it might be some guy in the woods, scoping us out. We were frozen for a few moments, as to not make any noise. Then, we both saw a silhouette of a very large thing. Whatever it was, we were able to make out that it was like a giant hairball running across the road. We were pretty scared at this point, looked at each other, and said, "Let's get out of here." My guess is that it was at least 7 feet tall, with a very heavy stride. We both took off back to camp. When we got back, we told our scoutmaster, and all he did was laugh and say, "Yeah, sure, now get back to bed." I kind of avoided it out of my mind for years, always believing that something was there, and I just kept it to myself. Then I found the BFRO, and reading lots of stories on this area. I'm 37 now, and to this day, I still think about that night, and wonder to myself, was I dreaming that night or not? I don't think I was. Riding my bike through the woods with some friends, I had to stop to wait for them when I heard a branch snap, no more than 40 feet away. It looked right at me with large black eyes. It was roughly 8 to 9 feet. I got a good look too. I'll never forget. He was proportioned the same way a human being would. It was scary, with blackish brown rust-colored hair. The hairs on his arm were roughly 3 to 4 inches long. His forearm was about the size around as my leg, about 20 inches around. His strides were long, say 10 feet per step. He must have been watching me for something, because I stopped, already a minute, when I heard a branch snap. I glanced over. I was shocked, tried to figure out what I was looking at. He just stared. No noise, no motions, no gestures, no nothing. Very frightening, because you don't know what he is capable of. It was as if he was thinking of coming towards me. He was very close. I froze like a rock. I turned my head to see what my friends were doing, then turned back to look at him. He was still there. I know he got a good look at me too, because it looked like he stooped his head down slightly, peered hard at me. Then, he turned, raised his arms to gain his balance, and stepped into the woods. He didn't turn away from me, but rather walked to my left, his right. Then I lost sight of him. I've told this story to many people, but I don't think anybody believes what I saw. I guess I didn't believe it either, until I saw one with my very own eyes. It was at least 2 a.m. in January or February. The temperature was in the low teens. I was dropping off a friend at his home, the back of which was separated from the highway, Route 72, by roughly 200 yards of woods and a dirt road. There are no homes or street lights on this part of Route 72. The east side is completely untouched woods, for miles, that goes into Burlington County. This area was the end of a development that had never been finished. Work stopped in the late 1970s as a part of the Pinelands Preservation Act. There was a dirt road, about 30 yards behind the house, which connected to the east into a grid of unfinished, unpaved roads. At that time, his house was the last house on that road, completely surrounded by woods. We were talking beside the car, under the streetlight, for at least 20 minutes, when we both heard a woman screaming. It sounded like it was coming from the unpaved road behind his house. We both thought somebody was in trouble, so we ran inside his house, grabbed a flashlight, knife, and a hatchet. We ran into a trail along the right side of the house, southeast, which led out to the dirt road. We could hear the screams getting louder and more to our right, into the woods. We were only about 40 paces into the woods when I began feeling very uneasy, and I began to realize that this wasn't a woman screaming. I could hear it now to my right, more like a loud whistling now, not ahead in the dirt road like I had thought, about 15 yards away. We both stopped and listened for a few moments. My friend had the flashlight scanning the woods, which was new-growth oak saplings, blueberry bushes waist high, and 12 feet to 14 feet, scrubby pine saplings, maybe 20 years old, if I'm guesstimating right. I could hear it heaving as it breathed in, exhaled out, with a very loud, high-pitched whistling. We could not see anything, but it was very close to our right, as we faced southeast, within 10 yards. My friend immediately turned toward me and said, "That ain't no girl screaming," quickly moved past me, back toward the house. I was standing still, listening. It was still screaming right at us. At this point, I knew it was not a girl at all. More like a loud whistling is how I would best describe it. There was no other screams that night. There was no movement at all. No sound of struggle. I thought that it might be a wounded animal, like a deer or something. It was so loud, and the deep breathing noises were from a much bigger animal than a fox. In fact, I could distinctly hear it breathing in and out rapidly to make this screaming noise. I remember thinking that it's dangerous to be this close to a large, wounded animal. It was not anything like I had ever heard in my life. I turned and headed back, looking and listening. It was still screaming, but did not follow. We instantly called the police and reported it. Within 15 minutes, we went back outside. Now the screams were further toward the southeast, very faint now. It had definitely moved off quickly. The screams faded totally within 10 minutes' time. We listened for at least another 45, but it was gone. I don't know what the police would have done after we'd called. I always just thought it was a wounded animal of some kind, but I guess I'm wrong. After reading the accounts posted, especially those from Ocean and Burlington counties, I knew that I also had a similar story. I had heard similar stories of a woman screaming in the woods and Manahawkin from relatives who'd lived in the area since the early 1930s. They said it was accompanied by an awful smell and would come around at night during extremely hot or extremely cold seasons. They always expressed concerns that hunters would come and hurt or kill it, so it was a best-kept secret. I never believed them until I heard it for myself. Even after all these years, I still find it difficult to discuss what exactly I saw. I still vividly remember the encounter and how terrified my friend and I were afterwards. It's amazing how time slows down during intense moments. Every detail burned to my memory. But in actuality, only several seconds passed. To be honest, I don't know exactly what I saw that summer evening long ago. As a child growing up, we were taught in school the legends surrounding the Jersey Devil and weird happenings in the Pine Barrens. Hopefully this story won't be viewed as lore that the region is famous for. The only thing I can say for sure is it really did happen, and I will do my best to portray the event as I remember it. I grew up in a middle-sized town, a few miles from both the Jersey Shore and the edges of the Pine Barrens. My neighborhood and town were undergoing a growth spurt, and wooded areas where I played as a kid were now strip malls or homes. My house was on a corner lot, and the neighbor's house directly in front was a summer cottage. They were not there at the time. I was 18 in 1989 and recently graduated from high school with a strict midnight curfew. My friend dropped me off at the time with the passenger side of the car, facing the front of my house. I was outside of the car, talking to Scott through the passenger side window. That's when we both heard a rustling sound near the trees on the corner of my neighbor's property, about 30 feet away. There was a streetlight on the opposite corner, and I could not make anything out beyond it. We did not think much of it, and continued to talk. The rustling returned a little louder, and with a sound that I remember as something being dragged on concrete, such as a stick. At this point, I asked Scott if he saw anything over there. At first, his reply was no. Then he hesitated, said he sees something like a big dog that is sitting by the trees. Not wanting to be bit by some rabid dog, I got in the car. We went up the road and turned the car around on the opposite intersection. Once around, we were facing my house, and there was what appeared to be a large grayish dog directly under the street lamp. We began moving very slowly toward my house. As we got closer, it really did not appear to be like any dog I had ever seen before. When we were roughly 50 feet away, I turned to Scott, asked him to turn on the high beams. It is here where things happen very quickly, and I will try and capture it as best as I can. To our horror, what we thought was a large dog stood up and began to run on two legs. It crossed the car and ran on an angle at first toward the middle of my house, but then quickly changed course and went around the dark side of my house. We're both yelling, "What is that? What was that?" repeatedly. The creature was very tall. His head was taller than the top of the windows on the house, so I'm estimating around 8 feet. He appeared to be light gray in color, but it could have been the lights reflecting off his hair. His arms were long and lanky, sort of swayed forward as if he ran. He had amazing speed and agility, and ran with one would consider to be an odd gait. His head was tilted forward, and he might have been slightly hunched over. His head swayed between looking forward and looking at us. I will never forget the way his eyes reflected in the headlights. The total time we had eyes on the creature was around 5 seconds. Once he disappeared, the car accelerated around the corner, and Scott slammed on the brakes, expecting to see the creature in the headlights. There was nothing but dark road. He was gone. Not wanting to get out of the car, we proceeded to Scott's house, just a few miles away. After a quick phone conversation with my parents, they demanded that I come home. They were waiting out front when we got there. We tried to explain what we saw. My parents would hear none of our tale and assumed we were either drunk or on drugs. We were both rather shaken by the event. My parents began to question their original assessment. Over time came the inevitable ridicule of family, friends, and alike. And their mocking I never really wanted to discuss with anyone again. It took years before I was comfortable being alone, even at night. After spending time in the military, I came to the realization that he was as scared of us as we were